Okay, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going to The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. We are on part 3 and the last half of part 3. So let's get started. And we will start with Rob. The order is going to be Rob, Sherri, Maritza, Rupali, and Iris. And then we will go to comments and questions from everybody else. Rob, the floor is all yours.
Okay, I've got two things I want to cover today. One of them is going to be, the second thing I'm going to do is the modern artists that we get at the beginning of this section, the little gathering at Lois Cook's and Ike the Genius and his play. But before that, that's what I find really fascinating about this section. The last part of part 3 is this turning point for Dominique. And it happens really after her wedding to Wynand, where she begins to discover that he's not the Gail Wynand she thought he would be. That she, there's actually a, hold on, let me see if I can find the exact quote. It wasn't, it's here in the 490s somewhere. She says, "You're not what I thought you would be. I thought it would be, boastfulness and guilt, and guilt." I don't know if she says that here. Anyway, I will find it later. But she's not what she thought. She discovers that he's someone who's like her, and she finds this by, of course, by putting him through all these ordeals, because that's what Dominique does, right? So she puts him the ideal of this gaudy, as he calls it later, a circus wedding. She wants the kind of wedding that would be appropriate to Mrs. Wynand Papers, the sort of populist, vulgar approach that characterizes his media empire. And so she insists on being this big wedding, and that he thwarts her by banning it from being reported in the Wynand Papers, and he gets to do it his own way after all. And similarly, and there's an interesting section about that, about how he keeps her out of public life. He fires Sally Brent, the gossip columnist from the Banner, for getting an interview with her. He keeps her locked away, and he goes through all these efforts to keep her from going out into the world and being involved with charities. He intercepts her mail and removes any invitations she has. So what he's doing, of course, is he's doing exactly what he did with his art gallery, right? He has this beautiful art that's all sealed up in this private gallery, never seen by anybody in the outside world. And that's what he's doing. She's part of his art gallery. She's part of the ideal that he grasps in his own independent judgment, that he wants to keep privately for himself and not be part of the outside world. But for her part, what she's astonished by the fact that here's this guy who actually, she expected him to be a reflection of the Wynand Papers, and in fact is the opposite of the Wynand Papers. He's her type of person. He's someone like her. And she discovers this while putting him through it's the gaudy wedding and then the play, no skin off your nose, that she makes him go see. And she begins to have this revelation. And the main thing that happens there that struck out to me is that he starts saying things that remind her of Rourke. And that's sort of when her brain starts to, spin out and realize something's going on here. One here is I think there's a couple, might be one or two earlier, but there's one after that play, going to see the terrible play that's been promoted by the Banner. He says, "I did suffer tonight as you wanted, but it was pain that went only down to a certain point, and then," and that's she shouts, "Shut up!" She screams, "Shut up, goddamn you!" And she blows up. She has a.
I'm sorry. You just keep going.
Okay, and then she apologizes to him and says, and here's the interesting thing. She says, he realizes that she reacted to the idea of a pain that goes down only at a certain point. And she says, "Why is it that he asked her, "Why is it you're reacting to that?" She says, "The pain that stops at a certain point, nothing, only that you had no right to say it. The men who have pay for that right, a price you can't afford. But it doesn't matter now. Say it if you wish. I have no right to say it either. And then she says, I think we have a great deal in common, you and I. We've committed the same treason somewhere. No, that's a bad word. Yes, I think it's the right word. It's the only one that has the feeling of what I mean. So what, did you have something you were?
Oh, there was another spot where.
Oh, okay, another spot where he recognizes something. Oh, here we go. Yes, there's an earlier point at which this is during the wedding, the circus wedding, as he calls it later on. She says, she watched Wynand intently. She wanted to see him take pleasure in all of this, if only for a moment. Let him accept and join just once, she thought. Let him show the soul of the New York banner in its proper element. She saw no acceptance. She saw a hint of pain at times, but even the pain did not reach him completely. As she thought of the only other man she knew who had spoken about suffering that went down only to a certain point. So here's what we're getting is she's starting to have this realization of two things. First of all, she has these things that remind her of Rourke. And later on, just before the very end here, there's she's looking at him and she's reminded of what Rourke was saying. I breathe for my own necessity, for the fuel of my body, for my survival. I've given you not my sacrifice or my pity, but my ego and my naked need. She heard Rourke's words, Rourke's voice speaking for Gail Wynand, and she felt no sense of treason to Rourke in using the words of his love for the love of another man. So she's seeing these parallels between Rourke, Wynand reminding her of Rourke, realizing she's his type of person, but also realizing that the two of them there's something similar between her and Wynand. As she says that they both committed the same kind of treason. And by the way, here we also get a couple of, in these sections with her and Wynand, we get a couple of really interesting insights into previous events that have happened. So here on page 496, where he says, we're talking about integrity and his, the habit he have of finding men of integrity and breaking them. She said, Wynand says to her, do you know what you're actually in love with? Integrity, the impossible, the clean, consistent, reasonable, self-faithful, the all of one style, like a work of art. That's the only field where it can be found, art, but you want it in the flesh. So I think that gives us an insight why he has this secret hidden art gallery and why he goes there and what he gets out of it. And I think that Sherri mentioned one of the previous times that he goes to this art gallery, his secret art gallery, and he comes out and he has a look of suffering, but at the same time, his face looks 10 years younger. What he gets from going there is seeing this vision of integrity, but the pain is from the fact that he believes, like as Dominique believes, that it can't survive, that it can't be made real in the outside world. So that's why he has his art. He believes that's the only place in which integrity can be found is in art. But the other thing I think is interesting is he says, here we go. Why have you been staring at me ever since we met? Because I'm not the Gail Wynand you've heard about. You see, I love you, and love is exception making. He says, if you were in love, you'd want to be broken, trampled, ordered, dominated, because that's the impossible, the inconceivable for you in your relations with people. That would be the one gift, the great exception you'd want to offer the man you loved, but it wouldn't be easy for you. Well, there's a whole explanation there of everything that happened at the beginning of part 2 with her meeting Howard Rourke, right? So now we get these insights into why they behave the way they behave in earlier sections. But this all culminates at the very end of this section, where she says, we've done something strange to each other. I've given you what I wanted to lose, that special sense of living I thought this marriage would destroy for me, the sense of life as exaltation. And you've done all the things I would have done. Do you know how much alike we are? I knew that from the first. But it should have been impossible, Gail. I want to remain with you now for another reason, to wait for an answer. I think when I learn to understand what you are, I'll understand myself. There is an answer. There is a name for the thing we have in common. I don't know it. I know it's very important. So now we're setting up. This is, Dominique is at the point where now she's had this breakthrough, which she realizes there's some treason they've committed. There's some common error that she shares with Gail Wynand, and she's now looking to setting up that in part 4, she's going to be looking to understand that. And then when she's understood that, then everything will become clear to her. So,
And I love the fact that she uses the word treason.
yes. Why is that?
Because it's a negative. She realizes she's made a mistake.
Oh, yes. That's what tells her that she's ready now. It's like,
she knows there's a mistake.
She's been confident up to now, fairly confident that her view of the world was right. And she was confirmed in that. And I remember we talked earlier about the Stoddard trial. She was at the point of saying, what if you and I are wrong about the world, Ellsworth? And then Ellsworth cooks up the Stoddard trial, which is custom made to make her think she's absolutely right about the world, that anything that's good in the world is going to be trampled down and destroyed by the mob. So he confirms her in the idea that, yes, you are right about the world. But now she's starting to have the doubts again and actually starts to become convinced that there's something that she's done that's wrong. And she's just trying to figure out what it is. So that her character has made that sort of complete, is at the pivot point where she's making that turn from having the wrong view of the world, questioning it, having it reconfirmed, and now she's starting to realize that it was wrong. And she's trying to figure out, but she doesn't know yet why it's wrong or what the truth is. So that's what's waiting for the last part to be done. All right, now I wanted to talk, the other part thing I want to talk about was and I've got a little bit of a slideshow for this, which I'll get to in a second, not quite yet. Okay. But this section that we're doing today starts with this meeting of the American Council of Artists, what do they call it? But it's this Lois Cook's little group that Ellsworth Toohey and Lois Cook. And I love the fact that, at the beginning of this, before Peter Keating shows up,
Council of American Writers.
There we go. Before Peter Keating shows up, Ellsworth Toohey is there sort of lounging out on the floor, totally relaxed. And there's a section here about how he loved unrestraint. He was enjoying the unrestraint. So he's with a group of people. He doesn't need to put on an act. He doesn't need to play a part. They're all in on it, essentially, in on what he's trying to do to the culture. They're all fellow co-conspirators. It's only when Peter shows up that he gets up off the floor and he sits in a chair and crosses his legs and puts on the sort of elegant exterior that he has. But in this one, he's sort of free to be fully the nihilist that he is underneath. But it's this little group of them getting together and all sort of working together in different fields. You have a foreign correspondent, you have a poet, you have a playwright, you have all these, you have a critic, you have all these different people. It shows that it's our glimpse of sort of a wider modernist movement that is, and this happens right before Ellsworth Toohey comes out in favor of modern architecture, but it's this sort of German Bauhaus style modern architecture. So we're sort of getting this sketch of the architecture section of the book, which is what it's mostly focused on. It's the main setting. We're getting a sense of the wider context, the wider cultural context of sort of European style modernism coming from the Bauhaus that's having its impact in the US. So I wanted to go over a little bit of that. The main thing that, and especially in Ayn Rand's critique of modernism in art, is that the creativity of modernism consists primarily in breaking down and eliminating key aspects of art. So, the sort of Henry Cameron approach, and Sherri's going to talk, I'm going to leave the architecture stuff to Sherri because Toohey comes out, but when Toohey comes out in favor of modern architecture, she'll cover that. But there is a section from there that I think is important where it says, the sort of Henry Cameron approach, or as we saw the Louis Sullivan approach, is to go back to the basics and say, well, what is architecture? Well, you take one piece of stone and you put another piece of stone on top of it. You have a column, you have a lintel. That's you go back to the very basics and you build everything up from the very basics. And modernism sort of makes a show of doing that, but what they actually do is they say you get rid of the column and the lintel and you do architecture from there. Or at least that's the equivalent in other fields. So in poetry, we have Lois Cook, and Lois Cook is a very clearly a satire on Gertrude Stein, a fictionalized version of Gertrude Stein. And in poetry, what she does is she writes poetry without meter and rhyme. Now, meter and rhyme are the essential building blocks. They're the post and lintel of poetry. right? So if you have poetry without meter and rhyme, what do you have left? So it's the idea of this creativity as eliminating the essential aspects of the field. And there's a description earlier in the book about, I think Peter is reading about Lois Cook, and it's present, and her poetry is presented as sound. Now I want to talk about what that means, because the reason why meter and rhyme are so important to poetry is that in poetry, the sound of the words and the meaning are supposed to be integrated. That the sound of the words is used to amplify their meaning and to make the meaning more memorable, make it clearer, make it more powerful. Now, in prose, by contrast, you're concerned primarily with the meaning of the words. Now, as a prose writer, I'm concerned about the sound of the words. And if I can find a phrase that has a good alliteration or a good meter, a good rhythm to it, I'll use it. But it's secondary. It's secondary to, am I clearly expressing the meaning of the words? Am I using the words that clearly express the meaning I want? So the meaning of the words is primary, the sound is secondary. In poetry, the sound and meaning are reinforcing each other, and you're using the various techniques of that taking into account the sound of the words, the rhythm of the words, and the rhyme and other forms of parallel structures and all that sort of thing. You're using all of that to reinforce the meaning of the piece. Well, what Lois Cook is doing is, by doing sound as sound, is instead of an integration of sound and meaning, she has, if prose has meaning with sound being secondary, and poetry is an integration of sound and meaning, she has sound without meaning. That's the essence of her approach to poetry. And here's where I'm going to want to do a little screen share, because I looked up some Gertrude Stein for you, because I thought you all would enjoy this.
Nice. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. And this is probably Gertrude Stein's most famous one. This is Sacred Emily, I think is the poem. And this is where a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, which is like the only famous line from a Gertrude Stein poem. And in people think that when they say rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, they take it as meaning, things are what they are, or, something similar to Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet, where she says, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. That's not what it's about. Actually, rose in the context of this poem and the group of poems it's in, there was like somebody like her lawyer or something like that, whose last name was Rose. So that's that when she says Rose at the beginning, she's referring to this guy. And but I'm going to give you a sense for the poetry here. Argonauts, that is plenty. Cunning Saxon symbol of beauty, thimble of everything. Cunning clover thimble, cunning of everything, cunning of thimble, cunning. Place in pets, night town of glass, color mahogany center. Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Now, the poem goes on for quite a lot longer in that vein, but you get an idea. I mean, if you can tell me what any of that means, good luck to you. It's sound as sound, right? It's cunning, clover. You have symbol and thimble and the word cunning used over, and repetition of words and very superficial similarities between words being used to just substitute one word out for another. And it doesn't add to the meaning. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a collection of random words put together. There's a figure of speech that's come to be used recently called word salad. I heard this recently. There was I think it's a Russian diplomat trying to justify the invasion of Ukraine, and somebody referred to it very accurately as word salad. And you're referring to somebody just putting together a bunch of random words that don't really make any sense together. It actually is a term that came out of psychiatry at about this time. European psychiatrists at this time came up with the term word salad to refer to something that schizophrenic people do, that they'll have this whole series of words that come out that don't have any clear meaning or relation to one another. It's called schizophasia. And basically this poetry is word salad. And here's another one I found, a short one. And I'll just
can you read it with
no, I can't with this in place. That's fine. We'll see, the problem is I have to be able to, can I move this to the side somewhere?
You can probably move it to the bottom. Hang on.
I can't do it while I'm screen sharing.
Yeah.
See, I
Technical
did this-
difficulties.
Technical
sorry.
difficulties. I did the slide too wide, and now your images are all on top of it.
Yeah.
You know, don't worry about it. This is similar,
Yeah.
another similar
Hit
thing.
the,
We don't-
hit the minus button and it'll make all the images go away temporarily.
Do which?
No.
I think we can't do it while we're in.
Yeah.
While we're playing the slideshow. So hold
Let
on.
me
a
see if
second.
I can get it.
Oh, there we go. I can
you
do it now.
There we go.
A kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and arrangement in a system to pointing. All this and not ordinary, not unordered and not resembling. The difference is spreading. Again, is the, you know, if you could tell me what any of this means, probably somebody has done a master's thesis trying to read something into this.
Then they became schizophrenic.
And then they became schizophrenic. But
Sorry.
the other thing I find interesting about this one is there, you know, in the other one, there are line breaks that like let you know this is poetry, right? The only thing that lets you know the previous one is poetry is that there are line breaks in it. This doesn't even have line breaks. This is just random words. The only thing that lets you know that this is poetry is that it doesn't make any sense. All right, so now to give you, I also wanted to have one more example to give you an idea of how widespread this sort of thing is and how since Ayn Rand wrote this, this has become, you know, totally commonplace and even sort of banal. So here's a contemporary poet named Rupali Kaur, Indian by way of Canada, I think. And she does these little things that have become a hit on Instagram, and she became the first best-selling poet in many years. And this one says, if you are not enough for yourself, you will never be enough for someone else. Now that's, you know, it's a true sentiment. It's you know, very appropriate. We're reading The Fountainhead because it's very similar to Ayn Rand's message. But the thing to notice about it is it really poetry, right? It's sort of like, it reminds me of more of one of those old motivational posters, right? We have teamwork and you have an image. And the only thing, there's no meter to it. There's no rhyme. There's no imagery. This is prose. It's a prose statement. And the only thing that would make you think that this is poetry is there's no punctuation and there's weird line breaks.
Almost like a haiku.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of that character of that what modernism did to poetry was it took out all the actual poetic elements. You know, we're going to have poetry without meter, poetry without rhyme, poetry without imagery, poetry, you know, you take all the things that makes poetry what it is and you take them out and you create and you make something. And it's, and what you get here and sort of the rap against this particular poet is that all of these are sort of these sort of banal, sort of motivational poster type of statements dressed up to look like poetry. So there's not all that much actual deep content to it. Now, I want to give you a couple more examples of what modernism was doing at this time. Now, we talked, Alzertui comes out in favor of modern architecture from a school from Germany, and this is a reference, without naming it, a reference to the Bauhaus. So the Bauhaus had a number of prominent architects. It was formed by Walter Gropius. It was run by Mies van der Rohe, a number of prominent architects who came out of it. But it also included choreographers, photographers, artists. Yeah, this guy, Oscar Schlemmer, was the choreographer and who's behind what we're about to look at here. So it included a number of people from different arts, all working together to put forward this sort of modernist approach. And this is from a ballet that Oscar Schlemmer did at the Bauhaus. Triadic ballet, it's called. But notice the main thing about this is the costumes. The costume, these weird, wacky costumes. I particularly draw your attention to the one on the far left, where there's a person in there, but the hands are covered by this weird bell-shaped thing with a ball and a spike coming out of it. The torso is another giant ball, that geometric shape.
There's a leg back there.
Yeah, their one leg is encased in one kind of container, another kind of covering. The head is half covered by a round thing on one side and some other misshapen thing on the other side. And because here's a couple of others to give you an idea of the costumes used for this ballet. Oh, we go too far. Okay, so it's another set of costumes. So what this is ballet. This is dance without the human form, right? So ballet or dance uses the human form as its basic medium, the movement of the body. and the line of the body, the line of the legs, the line of the arms. And this is saying basically, no, we're going to cover up the human body. We're going to put it in this weird misshapen, we're going to put these add-ons over the body to create these weird misshapen shapes so that you will have dance without the human body. So again, it's this idea of modernism consisted of taking each art and taking its essential elements away from it, depriving it of its essential elements. Now, I'm not going to subject you to modernist music for the period, but I'll point out that the main trend the main trend in modernist music was what's called atonalism. Now, tonality or tonicity is a basic concept developed, over thousands of musical concept developed over thousands of years. Now, so for those who remember, in talking about Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto, I played a piece, a Chopin piece on piano, and I talked about how the language of classical music and how it conveys meaning. And the essence of that piece was that you had a progression of notes going down to a bass note. Right? And the idea of a bass note that serves as the basis for a scale and as a basis for chords, the bass note of a key in which so if you have a piece of music that's in B minor, or I think it was E minor, it was a prelude, Chopin's prelude in E minor. If you have a piece of music that's in E minor, that gives you a series of notes in a scale that are related to that bass note, gives you a series of chords that are related to that bass note, and it tells the ear, here's the bass note, that's what they call the tonic note, around which everything else relates, and that helps you understand what the music is doing. And in that case, we had the essential structure of that prelude was a series of falling notes going down, da 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 dum da. They're falling down and they're trying to get to and to reach that bass note, that home base of the tonic note. Well, the main trend, and that's such a fundamental concept that goes through all of Western music, and actually to some extent, not just Western music, but many other kinds of music. And it's developed to a highly sophisticated level over a period of more than 1,000 years of innovation in music. And then the big modernist trend in the early 20th century was atonality. So there is no bass note, there's no scale and no chords that are all oriented around a single note, that everything is atonal. And if you've heard this sort of thing, you've heard that it just sort of sounds like a series of random sounds with no connection and no integration. And I would say that Ayn Rand was writing about this in 1938 to 1942, and it gets worse after her. This is going to become a theme, that all of this gets worse after her. And it culminates in 1952 with a guy named John Cage, sort of the ultimate modernist composer, whose most famous piece is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So there's no music at all. He's this idea of
no sound at all.
Yeah, no sound at all. That there's this idea of modernism, the innovation of modernism being that you take the essential elements of the art and you remove them. Its final end result is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of actual silence. That you've removed every single aspect of music, including sound itself. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of painting. Again, these are from, and we're going to start with the Bauhaus school. All right, so this is Vasily Kandinsky, one of the Bauhaus guys. And this is a painting from 1925. So this would have been like just a little before or at the very earliest years of the Bauhaus. And it's a series of random shapes and colors. And what's been removed from painting is representationalism, is the idea of anything being any portrayal of any object in the real world. This is just random shapes and colors that are supposed to somehow correspond to his internal feelings. But how do you know what internal feelings they correspond to if none of them represents anything that you can recognize? Yeah, if you see the Michelangelo's David, you can guess at what you get a really good idea, an immediate idea of what it is that Michelangelo was trying what he was feeling and what he was trying to convey to you, because you have a human figure. You can ask, if I saw a human figure in this pose with this expression on his face, with this kind of body, how would I feel about that? What would I think about that? What would that have to say about the world? You have nothing to go on here. It's random shapes and colors, and it expresses, who knows, maybe something, but you have no objective reference for it. And like I said, that one of the themes here is this all gets worse after Ayn Rand writes The Fountainhead. So here we have Jack the Dripper. This is Jackson Pollock, famous for this technique where he would drip paint on it. Sherri had an architectural history professor who called him Jack the Dripper.
In class.
So this is the creatively named Number One. It's one of his earliest ones. And it's from 1949. And this gives you an idea of where the concept of representing, so it's interesting that Pollock goes through some of his earlier works before this have the same kind of swirling kind of look, but there's some sort of vaguely recognizable human figure in there somewhere, or a dog, or there's some representational object. And this is the point where she bursts through and it totally eliminates the representation of anything having to do with the real world. And it's just a total confusion of swirls and colors and various swirls and drips.
I thought it was really funny. You said one of his early works. It's Number One.
Yes, that's number. Well, I think it's the idea is this is Number One because it's like the
Of
first
this
one he
type,
did
yeah.
of this type where he really broke through. And of course, this is famously lampooned by Norman Rockwell in this painting where he shows this is called The Connoisseur, and this very old-fashioned gentleman. You can tell by his hat and his suit and his umbrella.
It's proper umbrella.
Yeah, very proper old-fashioned gentleman standing very, very close to this painting, as if you're going to see something more interesting the closer up you are, and sort of representing the confusion of trying to find some sort of meaning in this art. Now, little fun side note: this is 1961 that Rockwell did this. A little side note: Rockwell actually created that painting first. That was the first thing he did, is he created the painting and then put the rest. The abstract painting and put the rest of everything in front of it. He took part of that abstract painting in the background, submitted it to an art show, and won first prize. So it's sort of like saying, I could be a modernist if I wanted to be. I could be just as good at Jackson. I could outdo Jackson Pollock if I wanted to. And now the final version of that sort of abstract approach is a guy named Mark Rothko, who became famous for doing these paintings that are just rectangles and squares of color on top of one another. And eventually he produced something that was called the Rothko Chapel. Now, this is the equivalent in painting of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. This was a chapel adorned with his paintings. Each one of his paintings is simply a complete wash of black paint. Now, the interesting thing about this, this is completed in 1971. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Rothko himself did not live to see it because in 1970, he committed suicide.
Fell into a deep depression.
He fell into a deep depression and committed suicide. And when you look at the paintings, that's what he's painting. He's painting, this is basically oblivion that he's painting. He's painting his desire to wipe the world out of existence. So it's almost like, but what you see here is this idea of the total elimination of any actual element of art. It's just a black canvas. And I couldn't resist, because of that Norman Rockwell painting I had earlier, I couldn't resist this particular photo I found online of someone going to appreciate this totally blank canvas. And I think the only music that you could have to go along with this blank canvas would, of course, be John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So there you are, appreciating modernist art in its purest form, a totally blank black canvas against totally blank concrete walls, listening to silence. So that's what happens when you have the trend of modernism becomes that you find creativity in the elimination, the subversion and elimination of all of the key elements of a work of art. Now, one last thing though, because
stop sharing, or
we can stop sharing. I think that's the last one. Yeah, we can stop sharing now. We can go out of that and stop sharing. All right. So the one now in Ayn Rand's little thing of the Council of American Writers, that the which they don't really discuss so much the art in there, although it's sort of referred to obliquely, but that it's the role of the critic. Jules, the real purpose of that is Jules Fugler, a new character being introduced, who's clearly they have this little exchange where he says to Tui, I never have to, Tui says to him, I never have to tell you how to do things. And he says, I never have to explain myself. I never have to explain myself to you, Ellsworth. So they're clearly, they're brothers, they're allies. And Jules Fugler says he's going to make Ike's terrible play about Muskrat. He's going to make it into a hit. And it's great because I said it's great. And this reminded me a lot of something that Tom Wolfe. So if you want to understand, I think a good companion to this is a book by Tom Wolfe called The Painted Word, which he wrote in the 1970s, which is sort of his critique of modernism in painting. And specifically what he focused on was the role of the critic, the role of the art critic. He focused a lot on a guy named Clement Greenberg, who was an art critic at the time, who was the guy who basically took up the cause of Jackson Pollock and made Jackson Pollock great. And if you think of that painting of the connoisseur standing in front of Jackson Pollock, the idea is it wasn't, Jackson Pollock didn't become a famous, world famous painter because people walked up and saw his paintings and saw something great in them. They thought he was a great painter because critics like Clement Greenberg told them he was a great painter. And Tom Wolfe concludes that the writings of the critics were the real art. That he says, he said that at the very end of the book, he says that the art galleries get it all wrong. They put the artwork up big on the wall and have a little plaque at the side with the words describing it. It says they have the words of the critics ought to be the big thing up on the wall, and the works of the artwork and the work of the artist should be in a little plaque off to the side, because it's the words of the critics that are really what give value and meaning to the artwork and not the artwork itself. And I think Jules Fugler is there to make a very similar point in The Fountainhead. All right, so that's that. I just wanted to give that context of what else was going on in modernism at the time to give an idea of what she's referring to here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Rob, I very studiously avoid all the modern art stuff in New York, which is very hard to do.
Yes, it is.
So thank you for a short tour. But you need that to see what is going on. Thank you. Next up is Sherri.
Yes, so I wanted to tie into what Rob was talking about here and bring this in to architecture as well, but we're going to take a little architectural history to this too. But let's start here with this section on page 437, when Ellsworth Toohey becomes a supporter of the cause of modern architecture. It says here, in the past 10 years, while most of the new residences continued to be built as faithful historical copies, the principles of Henry Cameron had won the field of commercial structures, the factories, the office buildings, the skyscrapers. A little further down, it says, it was a pale, distorted victory, a reluctant compromise that consisted of omitting columns and pediments and allowing for a few stretches of few stretches of walls to remain naked. The sole part of his argument, irresistible to the owners of the new structures, was financial economy. Then we read here that in many countries in Europe, most prominently in Germany, there's a new school of building that's been growing for some time, consisting of putting up 4 walls and a flat roof and a few openings, and that was called architecture. The freedom from arbitrary rules for which Henry Cameron had fought, the freedom that imposed a great new responsibility on the creative builder, had become mere elimination of all effort of mastering historical styles. It became a rigid set of new rules. So instead of what Cameron was saying, here's a quote from him, a building creates its own beauty, its own ornament, and it's derived from the rules of its theme and its structure. then it becomes, in this new style, a building needs no beauty, no ornament, and no theme. So what's completely fascinating to me is that Ayn Rand is writing this at a point when this actually is happening. The ideas that came out of the Chicago School of Architecture back, remember, if you were all here during our talks on Louis Sullivan, we're back to the Chicago fire again. This great Chicago fire that created this massive need for new buildings and new materials and new forms, and this creative sense of needing to have those forms fulfilled by the nature of those materials. That was grown out of the work of many men. Get a little mixed up here.
Yeah.
It's coming from Sullivan. It's coming from John Wellborn Root. It's coming from William LeBaron Jenney. It's coming from Frank Lloyd Wright. All of these ideas, and they do thread further back into the 19th century than that. But there was that great burst of activity that happened in Chicago at that time. And we know from those discussions that was tamped down during the World's Columbian Exhibition. But what was happening at that time is Frank Lloyd Wright, who had been very busy doing his work, had created a series of portfolios. It was individual leaves of a book, and they're called the Wasmuth Portfolio. They were published in the US in 1910. They were translated and published in Germany in 1911. But the year before they were published in Germany, Frank Lloyd Wright spent an entire year in Europe and in Germany, essentially helping to make sure that this production happened, that these drawings would get out into the world. So the weird twist of fate is that he had 500 copies of his work at his house in Taliesin. And these were the kinds of publications that you just can't call up Amazon and have it reprinted. These were individual sheets put together almost by hand, very, very labor intensive. So these 500 American copies of the portfolio burned in a fire at Taliesin, which totally dampened the ability for those ideas to be distributed around the US. Those seeds were killed off there. But this portfolio goes off to Europe and is seen by all of these architects who were doing some of their own things too. They're playing with their own modern ideas, their own ways of understanding new materials and all these new things that were happening there. But there's a difference there. In the Chicago School, these ideas were based, we learned this from our whole series of lectures on Sullivan. These ideas were really part of individualism and part of democracy, and yeah, there was some woozy transcendentalism in that philosophy, but it was fairly sound base ideas. Well, when these ideas get transported, remember when we talked about art in the Romantic Manifesto, there's always what the creator puts into the work. Theirs is their own contained thing. There's also what the viewer takes from it. And that is what ends up happening. So in the Bauhaus, you have this growing sense of, and it's throughout a lot of the European modern architects, this growing sense of, I don't know if I go so far as to call it communism. The Nazis did call it that. but very much socialism growing into a fundamental core of the design ideas, that it wasn't supposed to be about the individual, it was supposed to be about the collective. And so the modernists in the Bauhaus, there's stories about the day that this Wasmuth portfolio shows up, and then it completely halts all work while they pour detailed over these drawings. And I'll show you a few of them in a minute. These ideas are deeply influencing to all of these modernists, but because they have a different fundamental philosophical outlook, they take it in a different direction. And so when Ayn Rand is writing this, and she's talking about how the German modernists are taking all of the life and humanity out of a building, she's talking about what happens in the future in modern architecture. And she's pinned it so perfectly that I always get this chill running down my spine. I've read this book, I don't even know how many times. Still, every time I get to that section, knowing she's writing this before it happens, and she's so dead on, it always sends chills down my spine. And I think that the fundamental reason for that is because she understands the philosophy. She understood the slightly mixed philosophy of the original Chicago school. She understood the philosophy that was happening in art and in architecture in Europe at the early stages before the Bauhaus came to the US, really. And she knew what that inevitable conclusion could very well be. So let's take a little look and see what happens. We're going to have to bounce back to the beginning. I don't think we.
Oh yeah, I'll do it.
Yeah,
Where's
share
your
screen.
There we go.
And we got to go to the
week 8. Got the right week. I'll show you
all the way to the front. Okay, so. All right. So this is one of, well, these are actually 4 plates from the Wasmuth portfolio. This is a residential house. And you can see a lot of the character really comes from the illustrator. These are not complete, these are not Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings. These are his illustrator's drawings. So her skill here is really brought to play, and she really deserves a lot of this kind of credit for how powerful these drawings were. But you can see the very, very modern, clean lines. It's not devoid of humanness at all, not in the least. Here's another. This one is from the Larkin building. Do I have that? What's it say on the side? Oh, that just says that. And this one, also you can see this very, very clean lines, very rigid geometry. When this gets there and they absorb all of this, one of the architects from that school is Mies van der Rohe.
Ludwig Mies van der Rohe.
Who's not to be confused with Ludwig van Mises, which is always a confusion. But no, Mies van der Rohe, sometimes in Chicago just known as Mies. And I'm not giving it the proper pronunciation because I'm just not going to. This is one of his apartment complexes that's built in Chicago. It's known as 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive. So they're 2 separate buildings. So they take these ideas, in their mind, they're taking form follows function. And they're taking this idea that every detail has to come from the structure, which we'll follow here in a second of exactly how that comes across. They're really after this all of one thing. They're after this love of modernism, but just like Rob was pointing out with all of the other forms of modernism, they're doing an elimination. They're eliminating many parts of what, say, the early Chicago school architects were looking at. And what they end up doing is they're eliminating the individual, and they're eliminating all of those parts that make these structures really, that would make a residential structure a human thing. So here is the base of this building. And of course, they're showing off the structure. So they're making this is the first time. This is so common for us to see nowadays, where you see this outer rung of columns, and then this giant stack of floors above your head and nothing supporting it, so that you can walk around on this white terrazzo out here and not have the building fall on your head. But when it first happened, this was the first time this had ever happened. So this was really groundbreaking. But you notice it's all about steel and glass. But remember, they're thinking that it has to be about no ornament. It's just about the structure. Except if you'll notice here, this is looking up one of the corners. One of the things that is really truly common about a lot of these, what they call glass and steel skyscrapers, and a lot of this architecture, is that it is absolutely, completely full of ornament. So if you look up this corner, you'll see I-beams, but on either side of each column of windows. These I-beams that you see, mini little I-beams, serve absolutely no structure purpose whatsoever. They are there as ornament. I'll show you a detail. This is a construction detail of this building. Now you can see the giant H-shaped column of I-beam in the middle of this big square in the corner, and all these little dots and squiggles around it. That's representing concrete. So of course, Chicago, having had that massive fire, would not allow you to build a structure out of exposed steel. It had to be encased in fireproofing concrete. So instead of showing the concrete, what they're doing is they're taking these little I-beams and putting them on the outside as ornament, all the while claiming that they're not using any ornament. So that's these three. So you can see in the little hash lines, the big wide H shape in the middle, that's the structure. This concrete around it is actually fireproofing, not structure. And then the outside cladding of the building with these I-beams, these little ones, there's one on the side and two on the bottom here. This is completely ornament. Then you have another thing that happens, and this gets to this idea of socialism, of removing the classes. So, and I got my architectural degree from the school that Ludwig Mies van der Rohe formed in Chicago called IIT, when he emigrated to the US after the Nazis essentially shut down the school. Because they were communists, they felt that they were communist. The Nazis felt that the school was too modern and too communist. They tried to control it. Eventually, the Gestapo came into the school. They shut it all down. They all fled to the US and then formed modernist schools here. Gropius went to Harvard. Mies here went to Chicago. So this apartment that's you're seeing up here in the top corner in the white area, not the sort of tan shaded area, this is what an apartment was. Now, yes, there are many, many places in big urban city centers where this is a lavish amount of space. But the thing is, and I always like to point you to these bathrooms. The thing I can tell you about this from going through the school system, the most important thing was to minimize absolutely everything. And that included space of what was needed. So bathrooms were always designed to the barest, absolute barest minimum that you could possibly use. Now, the benefit of going to an education like that is I could fit just about anything, just about anywhere, but it's a series of denials. It's you remove anything that maybe, elbow room might be nice when you're in the shower, Well, if it doesn't fit on a 5x5 grid, then it's not necessary. So in this particular luxury apartment, you don't even have a door in your bedroom. Now, yes, this is probably the house for for a single person or maybe a couple, but it is very, very bare to the extreme. Here's a 2-bedroom apartment. And I do like that you have 2 separate doors, so you could have 2 people living in this place. But again, nobody has a door. There's not even a door. And the bathrooms, again, if you look at them, they are the absolute minimum. And if you look in the living spaces, if anybody has ever sat in a Barcelona chair, that's what you're seeing drawn here. These Barcelona chairs are really only comfortable to sit in for about 5 minutes. They're a design that Mies did. They were intended for an exhibition space. They were intended to be looked at, not really sat in. But this is what one of these apartments looks like. Now, this is much later. This has been refurbished, renovated. It's a modern take on this apartment, but it's really about the emptiness. One of the things they talked about in all of this architecture, that when you go back to the basics, you go back to almost nothing. And so this residence is almost nothing. Now, when you are in such a place that gives you a view of the city, almost nothing is great because you've got this view. But what I like to point out is these spaces are hard floors, hard ceiling, and all glass. So the other thing that happens in them is they're echo chambers. So this is why every time you see one of these places, take a look at this fluffy rug. This rug, this is like a 6-inch pile rug. And it's got this gigantic fluffy puffy sofa. And even these little modern lounge chairs over in the back, they're not leather, they're suede. All of that is because the darn place echoes. And that is characteristics of these kinds of spaces. So again, that's another thing that you're devoiding the humanity of the place by eliminating the things that humans need. So here is another example. This is Crown Hall. This is the architecture building at IIT. It's on the south side of Chicago. What was structurally new at the time is this is a big wide open space. Well, wide open spaces at that time would have required a whole series of columns on the inside. Well, what they did in this particular case is these giant beams on the roof. There's actually 4 of them. There's 2 on either that you can't see off the photo, but these giant beams that go across the roof are holding up the entire ceiling so that inside there are literally no walls, at least no walls that go to the ceiling. And so this, when I was there as a student, was the way it behaved. You had rows and rows and rows of all white drafting tables. But if anybody who's done any drafting knows, you really want to take that table and angle it up. But it was so important to have this almost nothing aesthetic that we weren't allowed to do that. So everybody had to draw flat, and these are huge tables. So somebody with short little arms like me was often on my hands and knees on the table to draw at the top of the drawing because there's no other way for me to reach it. But again, part of the humanity that's missing is this.
I'm so upset I didn't get to see that. I should have gone and seen you at school some more. Okay, go ahead.
This is in Chicago, and you notice the floor is essentially, it's terrazzo. It's a hard floor. It's all glass and drywall on the ceiling, and there are no walls. And there's 4 different studio classes happening in this huge space. So everybody's studio class is opened to everybody else's studio class. And it's loud. And every time somebody drops their drink on the floor, you can hear it on the other side of the building. It's also Chicago, which gets really cold in the winter. So this building becomes absolutely freezing in the winter. And because it's all glass in the summer, it becomes absolutely sweltering. And when it does shine, of course, you notice all this frosted glass around the base. That is essentially a light diffuser. So if you happen to be facing, which is hard not to face the glass somewhere in the room, if you're facing the glass on a sunny day, you essentially catch snow blindness. It was very, very common for us as architecture students to be drawing on our hands and knees on the table with sunglasses on to keep ourselves from being able to see. So they've completely lost not only that human element, but they lost that function element. And then at the time, at its highest end, like in those luxury apartments, they can be really beautiful because they spend so much time paying attention to every detail. But when it gets down to trickles down to the masses, and that's really what they were after. They were after appealing to the masses. You get this, and this is Soviet worker housing in Estonia. And this is where these ideas ultimately go to.
And I should point out, this probably looks better than it did in the Soviet days, because this is modern Estonia.
Yeah, so they've renovated them.
Maintained and renovated.
Yeah, now to get, this is just, and I'm not joking, across the street, maybe a block away from Crown Hall. This is the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago when they were first built.
It's public housing.
Public housing, and it was this idea they took directly from the Bauhaus ideas that we can use these materials to make housing for the masses. But within 30 years, they were essentially being torn down because they became such inhuman, horrific living conditions that they created the most vile, dangerous places. And I was at IIT campus in the late 80s and the early 90s when these housing projects were really dangerous. And in our little campus of 11 blocks, because of the violence that was happening in the Robert Taylor homes, on 1 week in our college campus, we had 3 dead bodies on campus. And we were only 11 blocks. So it was not a very big place. But we also have this one. This one is in Minneapolis. And it's called the Riverside Plaza, again, meant to be affordable housing, but oftentimes affordable housing ends up being bare minimalist, really, really shoddily built sometimes, and removing every element of humanity. What I love about this one is that it also ties in to the Mondrian painting. As you can see, I don't know if you can see all that. There's panels of primary colors plopped in here and there throughout. This, of course, is also trying to be more renovated and trying, but they go inside and they totally change the elevations in order to, or not the elevations, the floor plans, in order to make them a little bit more human. Can we unshare? So what you end up happening in architecture is that she is predicting this, I think, a philosophical change that's happening. The Germans feel, the Bauhaus designers and many modern architects to this day who follow these kind of bare minimalist, they believe that they are following these ideas of form follows function, but they are doing it with a completely different philosophical underpinning, and that creates a completely different outpouring of it. So now when you watch, you'll notice that this sort of thing, very interestingly, in the 60s and the 70s, this Soviet worker housing kind of approach to architecture becomes the central home office building for modern American capitalism. And that is another interesting story that we'll have to wait for another time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. Next up is Maritza, Rupali, and Iris. Maritza.
So these I told Shrikant before the rest of you arrived, this is fewer chapters than we've read in the last couple of weeks, but I feel like the depth of what we're shown here is so much greater. So what we're seeing here, the biggest thing here is to me, there's two major facets, and Rob touched upon both of them, right? When he brought up, Ike and Tui a little bit, and then he brought up Dominique and Wynand in their personal interactions together. So I'm going to look at those central themes as well. I'm going to start with the American Guild Association. I forget what the name is. I always get it wrong. But the group of ragtag wannabes, as it were, that Tui has amassed about himself. The thing about that is that I've read this book many, many times. I cannot read that first chapter that we had for this week without it giving me chills. And it's chills of horror, actually, because of the casualness with which things that should be held sacred are just like trampled upon. And it's done so like nothing. And Tui is so pleased with himself. And we see here that what we've been seeing a glimpse of before, he's got a good already basis already. So we know from learning Tui's story, what he's seeking is to collect souls and power. And what his line and what he's trying to do is he wants to devalue the individual. And what I'm pulling out of the first two chapters we're looking at here today, this idea, so it's said a couple different times, but Ike says, he says, to write a good play and be praised for it, that's nothing. Anyone could do that. Anyone with talent, actually. And talent is just a glandular accident. Now I had to pause on that glandular accident because I was like, oh, the horror. But then, I'm going through a deep dive into the concept of, the evolving self, right? And how evolution plays a role in what we consider to be ourselves, right? So I paused there for a moment. And I was like, that statement, though, it's that cautionary tale that we've been talking about here together, the idea where we must remember that we walk upon the backs of our ancestors, right? So for you to dismiss a glandular accident that gives you a talent, you're leaving yourself crippled now. But Ike is saying anybody with talent can do this. It's no big deal. The achievement is to write a piece of crap and to have that praised. He's viewing that as an achievement. And for anyone who has slaved away on a product or a project, or even something that you've never presented to anyone, if you just were knitting a sweater and you've never knitted before, and it's sort of trapezoidal instead of rectangular, but you're still proud of it because it's your creation, right? But you're also not going to say that it's as good as the scarf of your grandmother who's been knitting, since she was 12, and she gives you these beautiful creations. Because somehow inherently, you're aware that to uphold your novice creation to her very much more experienced creation would be to diminish her respect. The respect of her creation is diminished if you demand that your novice attempt be on the level of hers. And that's what we're seeing here. And that is Tui's gain. And the most chilling thing here, I think it's actually in the next chapter here. So it's in the, I wrote down here in my notes which one it was. Page 472. And now I have an old copy, so I'm not entirely certain if the pages match, but should be in that general vicinity. Tui tells us, he talks about how he's playing puppeteer for these different people. And he says, but you know what, if you don't like someone who's a talented person and they're really good and they write this really good play, it's going to do you no good to tell people not to go see that play. They're going to see it anyway. And then it's good. So now you've lost the audience, right? He goes, but the better thing to do is to sell them on the fact that a crappy play is just as good as that good one. And if you can make them believe that and do it again, pretty soon, they won't be able to tell the difference. So imagine what a sad world it would be for you to look at my kind of trapezoidal shaped scarf and grandma's beautiful, perfectly made scarf and think they're the same. That here is what Tui is saying is the vision the world should aspire to. I don't know about you, but that leaves me cold, just cold. And that's what we're seeing here. And this here is the very first time throughout the book that it's stated so plainly. They've been alluding to it. And here you get the crescendo. So this right here is very close to the crescendo. It's not, there's still a little more. Tui is still, his song is still going up. So the thing here, that to me is like, it's really just, and that's the theme of these all the chapters that we read this week. That is the central theme of what you're going to find. What we're showing it from different perspectives and different angles. You're looking at it here, and it's like, I love that Sherri and Rob pointed out that Tui's, he's sprawled across the floor, and he's super, because these are all people he's collected. None of them is a threat to him. These are people he finds already in his pocket. I've already done my puppeteering with them. Those strings, very tight. They're not getting away. There's no need for me to hide. There's nothing. Absolute comfort, because there's nothing left here. Now, Peter Keating has been presented to us throughout the story as one of the masses that is a project of Tui. And Tui's letting us know that there are people who have no talent, but have the gall to believe that, and even Ike says it here in the first chapter we're looking at, he goes, why can't, sure, so-and-so is good, but why can't I get the same accolades as he does? And that's what you're hearing there, is somebody saying, I don't want to put in the work, but I want all the credit. And that's, again, something to leave you cold. That to me is the makings of a sick society. But that's what Tui is upholding. So the difference you see in Tui straightening up and changing the atmosphere in the room when Peter Keating walks in, it is because Peter Keating was in a different category than his merry group of no talents. The group of no talents didn't require work. They're the ones he found that already had this attitude, and they're the ones he's seeking to uphold. Peter was one of the ones that could have gone in either direction. And he put a lot of time, energy, and effort into ensuring that instead he fell on the side of the no talents. So that's the difference. And that's why we see the difference in the way Tui interacts with them, because he needs slight more authority. So he had to straighten out his tie, straighten himself up, his posture, because the perception, he is in the business of collecting souls. When he was sprawled across the floor, he already had all those souls. Keating is one that he believes he has most of, but in his mind, it's still a work in progress. So that's why he straightened himself up. And that's what I saw there. But on the other note, from Peter Keating's perspective, what we're seeing of Keating more and more is that the only opinions that he has are the opinions of that merry group of notants. So if we extrapolate that, more and more he is the creation of Tui. And we're going to see that, because remember, now we're watching, Peter has hit his crescendo, and now we're watching his declining notes here. And so that's the interaction there for those, and it shines a spotlight on Tui. There's one more conversation on Tui that Tui has. He has it with Alaskar, and on I forget what page is in chapter 8. There's a conversation between Alva and Tui about this other paper called The New Frontiers. And the interesting thing is that it actually sounds very similar to the very first paper that Gail Wynand purchased and renamed. The interaction, the conversation that goes back and forth is that Tui is writing for both of them, and he has backed this smaller paper. And I was like, it's not proper. Alpha doesn't quite understand, but what we're shown here, the reason that little conversation is in there is to show us, the readers, how vast the machinations of Tui are extending. And that's the perfect pivot note to jump forward to Dominique bringing up Tui to Gail Wynand. So, and there's so much more that I want to say about Dominique and Wynand's interactions. I'm going to do it a little bit out of order here, because I want to finish the thread of Tui first. And so what we view about Dominique is she's rethinking her initial impressions of Gail Wynand, right? But she still always remembers that she's Mrs., Gail Wynand, or Mrs., Mrs. Banner, newspapers. In a soft moment, she attempts to warn him about Ellsworth Tui. And she tells him, like, super, super seriously, like, they're on a yacht and they're being very lighthearted. And she gets very serious and says, Gail, fire Ellsworth Tui. And he looks at her and he's all confused. He's like, why? And she says, Gail, listen, I've never wanted to stop Tui. I've even helped him. I thought he was what the world deserved. I haven't tried to save anything from him or anyone. I never thought it would be the banner which he fits best, that I'd want to save from him. What on earth are you talking about? Gail, when I married you, I didn't know I'd come to feel this kind of loyalty to you. It contradicts everything I've done. It contradicts so much more than I can tell you. It's a sort of catastrophe for me, a turning point. Don't ask me why. It will take me years to understand. I know only that this is what I owe you. Fire Ellsworth Tui. Get him out before it's too late. You've broken many much less vicious men and much less dangerous. Fire Tui. Go after him and don't rest until you've destroyed every last bit of him. Here we see there's so much to unpack in that speech of hers. For a moment, I'm going to set aside her revelations about herself, and let's focus on what she's saying to Gail about Tui. She understands Tui in the way that we just got a glimpse of the real Tui behind the scenes. That Tui who was sprawled out comfortably with his little puppets, that's the Tui that she's seen all along, and the Tui she's trying to present to Gail. Now, she's unsuccessful. His pride, his hubris does not allow him to see it. In fact, he's very dismissive of her. And, he asks her, why would you even think of him now? She goes, because I know what he's after. So, Gail bites and he's like, all right, what's he after? And she said, control of the Wynand papers. And the problem here is that she says that, and he assumes that she means that Tui wants to become the leader of the papers. What she means, in fact, is that he wants control so that he can destroy. Wynand misses that. He laughs. He's totally dismissive here. And she tries harder, you know? She tells him, you've never understood him. And Gail says, I've never even bothered to try. Why on earth would I? And the interesting thing is he says he's perfect. He's perfect for my paper. Because remember that Gail understands that his paper it's a trash magnet. But she's saying he wants control of the Wynand papers as a means to an end. And she understands the end. The control of the papers is only because that's the biggest paper around, not because he himself wants to keep that. And Gail asks her, well, what's the end? She says, control of the world. So she's confirming for us that ugly glimpse we got of Tui just a little bit ago in that drawing room with Ike and Jules and the rest of them. And he's like, he thinks she's playing. Gail Wynand doesn't understand her seriousness. And she says, I'm serious. I'm terribly serious. And his hubris, as he says, control of the world, my dear, belongs to men like me. The Tuis of this earth wouldn't know how to dream about it. And she wants to explain to him, but he doesn't allow her. He forces her to change the subject, tells her she knows nothing about papers and that she doesn't understand the banner and he won't listen to it. So she lets it go. But we'll be reminded of this paragraph very starkly again as it goes on. But the thing there that I found fascinating is the clarity with which she views Tui. We, the readers, didn't even have this clarity of Tui up until a chapter ago. And I just find it fascinating. First of all, phenomenal writing. For those of you who get lost sometimes in the writing style, that is just the manner in which we're just spoon-fed those details and the picture and image of Tui is revealed. Brilliant, just absolute brilliance for any of you who's a writer. And in the style and the entire way in which it's done. Fascinating. And then from a more philosophical perspective, now we know exactly what Tui's about. And we know that Dominique, who has this entire novel, she has spent her time rejecting anything of value. She's not engaged with the world. She has purposefully refused because she doesn't believe the world deserves any help. She's trying to help so the reason that she married Wynand was because of his terrible paper. And, that's another form of, her not giving the world anything. So she's trying to help the banner. And that more so than anything tells us the crisis of self that she's experiencing. We're going here and I said at the very beginning of this book that Dominique is the character in this book who changes the most. She goes through so much. And if you set aside any initial distaste for her and see a little bit of yourself in her and walk through this book with her, the revelations that you might find about yourself could potentially be scary even. So, she's been searching and she's always thought that the banner was awful. And, the interesting thing here, so she has a couple, that one conversation with Wynand was when they were still on a yacht. And then later there's another one, and Rob did allude to it about them not speaking. And she hears Rourke's words speaking for Gail Wynand, and she finds that it's okay. And that's, and she tells him, one day I'll have to ask your forgiveness for marrying you. And he's like, what? And I love this that she says, I wanted you to be my chain to the world. And that shows us again what Dominique has been doing. I mean, because real talk, throughout this book, some of her actions, you just want to smack her. What are you doing? She's been trying to chain herself to the world, but it's a world that she doesn't think deserves her, because she's seeking the highest value. And she just doesn't believe the world has that. And she says to him, I wanted you to be my chain to the world. You've become my defense instead. And that makes my marriage dishonest, because she was entered into it. And she told him, and he goes, no, I told you I would accept you any way that you chose, for any reason that you chose. And she says, but you've changed everything for me. Or was it I that changed it? I don't know. She's experiencing, again, this crisis, her entire world. So I have said to people sometimes that, there exists in my life a point in my life that is this, it's a nail in my timeline. And I tell folks, I can point to that moment and say, the Maritza that was died that day. The Maritza that exists today had to rebuild from that point forward. I suspect what we're seeing here is Dominique's death and the beginnings of her rebirth. She's saying, we've done something strange to each other. I've given you what I wanted to lose. That special sense of living I thought this marriage would destroy for me. The sense of life as exaltation. And she's been searching all her life for that. And, when we spoke earlier in the chapters about the idea of Dominique was born in a society and in a world where everything was easy. She was, she's beautiful, she's rich, she glides along. She has spent her entire life seeking to be able to look at someone or something to look up to and not down. And she's not found it. And here, she's pausing and she's rethinking because she sees good and she's learning. And it's funny because in some of the philosophies of Ayn Rand, one could be led to believe that what she's upholding is a very strict, and she even has a quote that says, there's the good, the bad, and anything in between is pure evil. So that seems she's very, either or. But this character here would point that the feeling of the philosophy allows room for questioning. So it's one of those, and that brings me to, something that Francon tells us very, very often. He says, strong opinions loosely held. That's what we're seeing in this character here. She's allowing herself the room to reconsider because she thought she knew all about Gail Wynand. He's the banner. He's this corrupt, baseless person with no scruples. And even so, and he agrees that he is those things, but she sees that that's not the entirety. And she can see into him and see some things in common. She tells him, she goes, and you've done all the things I would have done. Do you know how alike we are? And that's the fascinating thing about the interaction between these two, is that you really do see both of them are rejecting the world. They're doing it in entirely different ways, but they're definitely both of them rejecting it. But the funny thing is, she didn't see it. He always did. And that's part of the reason. And if you guys will recall, he's never had any trouble saying to her, I love you. But if we go all the way back to my favorite saying, is this concept of, in order to say, I love you, one must know first how to say the I. Dominique is scared of her I. She's never been able to embrace it. And Rourke saw that in her, and this is the reason why he's given her space. Well, Gail doesn't have that. Because of his hubris, his eye is very strong. So he always saw that. She didn't. So she tells him, this should have been impossible, Gail. I want to remain with you now. And this is what, Rob read out for us. I want to remain with you, but for another reason, to wait for an answer. I think when I learn to understand what you are, I'll understand myself. There is an answer. There's a name for the thing we have in common. I don't know it, but I know it's very important. So now going forward, we know that her every action will be motivated by this desire. So what's pivotal and important here is that prior to this point, she's not been seeking. She's been avoiding. She's been evading. She's been rejecting. Now she is going to actively move forward because she's seeking an answer. And if we're viewing Dominique as the phoenix in this story, this is what you need, because one cannot grow unless one is moving forward. And up until this point, she's not been. Sure, you see her divorce somebody and go for somebody else, but she's not been moving forward. Basically, she's been moving in circles or left to right. Now we see this is her first step forward. And that's something for all of us. We have to realize, where have we been in our lives where we're just going in circles or we're going side to side? To take control of one's consciousness and to make that decision, I am going to stay here. This is not an ideal situation, but I'm seeking an answer. That is a strength of will and integrity that does leave one with chills of a different kind than what we saw when we were reading about Tui. And this is yet another reason why I have always had the utmost of respect for the character of Dominique. I mean, the courage necessary for this is mind-boggling, because now she sees she went wrong somewhere. And you know how they say, the contradiction, there are no contradictions. If you find one, you have to go back and check your premises. That's what she's doing here. But she's going to stay somewhere. We can't forget that she really wants to be with Rourke. She doesn't think the world deserves Rourke. And she cannot stand to watch the world have him. But now she's going to start questioning those thoughts. And that's what we're seeing here. Now she's ready. She's starting to say that. What I do want to say something interesting. Again, Gail Wynand has a depth of perception that Dominique does not have. And what struck me is, and again, this is brilliant, brilliant writing on behalf of the author. He says, I love you so often and so repetitively that it forces you to realize that contrast between the two of them. And what he says is, his speech is fascinating to take it and compare it to Rourke's, because it's the same, but in a different vein. He says, I love you so much that nothing can matter to me, not even you. Can you understand that? The answer is no, she can't, not yet. Rourke understands that though. We know that because he says, in order to say I love you, one must first know how to say the I. And that's the same thing right there that you're seeing. And he says, I've never taken much from the world. I haven't wanted much. They hold that in similar. And he says, though, that, where's that? He says, not in the total undivided way, not with the kind of desire that becomes an ultimatum. Yes or no. And one can't accept the no without ceasing to exist. That's what you are to me. But when one reaches that stage, it's not the object that matters. It's the desire, not you, but I. The ability to desire like that, nothing less is worth feeling or honoring. I've never felt that before. The fascinating thing here is that, and then in between, he says, I love you like 10 times. The fascinating thing here is that this is something she can't do. And he's miscalculated. In his earlier speech that Rob brought up to us, he tells her she's never been in love, because if she had been, she would want to suffer. She would want to be mistreated and mishandled, and she would make them suffer greatly. Now, we, the reader, know we can have a little chuckle because we're like, poor Vork, she's putting him through it. That's exactly what she's doing. He understands that instinctively within her. And so that's another thing. So this interaction, they are essentially, it's like somebody that you meet who has the ability to just reach inside you and go, look, see, can you see it now? That's what they're doing to each other. And it's not like it's just piece by piece. So it's gonna be, we're gonna be continue to see them. And it's almost sad when you read this speech of Gail's, because you understand that he hasn't, and we'll hear it further on, small spoiler, you know, the idea of he was never supposed to be a second-hander. And you see that so crystal clear here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Folks, even the panelists have the option today of putting a question on the table. So we'll collect all the questions and then we will take the best of them. Okay, so if you guys have, and also all the attendees, so we want to collect questions. Let's focus on collecting the questions as soon as we're done with the presentation. So it's going to be Rupali followed by Iris. Rupali.
Thank you, Maritza. That was amazing. Thank you. I'm going to pick up the thread of contrasts that Ayn Rand has done so beautifully in this book. And this time I want to focus on the contrast of Toohey and Gail Wynand. And the fact that both men want power, they both want to control. And how are they similar and how are they different in their journey? Now, Shrikant's representation with the triangle of the self being at the core with the work towards the world integrated with love becomes the driving, the prime motor, the driving force for humans. That's the triangle. And then we've seen through Shrikant's diagram in the previous meetups that Toohey and Peter Keating and Wynand are just in the reverse triangle where they are very destructive. So when we look at Toohey's goals, and Maritza, you explained that really well, that he is in the business of collecting souls, and he is focused on the mediocre, because both Wynand and Toohey don't want to bring out the best in people. They want to crush that. And what Toohey does is by bringing out the mediocre, he is saying, well, people are not going to look at the excellence that exists in humans, so in the work that they do. So why do we see Toohey promoting people like Ike or like Louis Cook or even Peter Keating? And that's so, he says that, what achievement is there? Well, actually, Fugler says this, but you can probably hear it in Toohey's voice. What achievement is there for a critic in praising a good play? None whatsoever. The critic is then nothing but a kind of glorified messenger boy between the author and the public. What's there in for me? I'm sick of it. I have a right to wish to impress my own personality upon people. But if a critic is able to put over a perfectly worthless play, then, and you do perceive the difference, therefore I shall make a hit of it. And so the fact that people like Fugler and Toohey, they are out to actually just, with their own insignificance, they don't want the people who can make a difference to stand out. So then Toohey goes on to say why it's simple, Lance, when the fact that one is total non-entity who's done nothing more outstanding than eating, sleeping, and chatting with neighbors becomes a fact worthy of pride, of announcement to the world, and of diligent study by millions of readers. The fact that one has built a cathedral becomes unrecordable and unannounceable. A matter of perspectives and relativity, The distance permissible between the extremes of any particular capacity is limited. The sound perception of an ant does not include thunder. And so here we see that, Toohey is out there to crush the best in humans. And then when you hear Gail Wynand talk about what he is after, and he recognizes, so in this section, we also kind of understand what Ayn Rand is talking about, dignity and integrity amongst the humans. So when Gail Wynand is talking to Dominique, he says, do you know what you're actually in love with? Integrity. That's impossible. The clean, consistent, reasonable, self-faithful, the all of one style, like a work of art. That's the only field where it can be found, in art. But you want it in flesh. You're in love with that. Well, you see, I've never had any integrity. And then he goes on to say, why have I done all that? And he talks about how he has crushed all the giants of integrity. So he says, but you've surely heard enough screaming about it. All the giants of the spirit whom I have broken. And we've seen this earlier in the section where he has taken men of integrity and put them in positions where they have to do things against their will, and how through his power and corruption, he's been able to crush those men of integrity and just not even thought about it. I don't think anybody ever realized how much I enjoyed doing it. It's kind of a lust. And I'm perfectly indifferent to slugs like Ellsworth Toohey or my friend Alva, and quite willing to leave them in peace. Now, here is his mistake, which we see that he does not understand Toohey's power, where he's collecting these people, these souls, to build the control over his newspaper. And Dominique sees that. So then he goes on to say, why have I done all that? Power, Dominique, the only thing I ever wanted, to know that there's not a man living whom I can't force to do anything I choose. The man I couldn't break would destroy me. So here's a little foretelling in this sentence. But I've spent years finding out how safe I am. They say I have no sense of honor. I've missed something in life. Well, I haven't missed anything. I haven't missed very much, have I? The thing I've missed, it doesn't exist. And so we are beginning to get an insight into how corrupt men, both Toohey and Gail Wynand, are both after power, and yet their methods are different. Now, both of them want control, and you can see Toohey is slowly getting control. We can see that in Alva Scarrett's conversation with him, where he says to Toohey that he is talking with another newspaper and building that. And then Alva says, well, they're married now. And he's shocked that he's not allowed to print any pictures of the wedding, but everybody else gets to print those pictures. And he says, by the way, did you know many papers dug up their old pictures of Dominique's nude statue from the goddamn temple and ran it right with the wedding story to show Mrs. Wynand's interest in the art? Are they glad to get back at Gail? Are they giving it to him, the lies? Wonder who reminded them of that one. And Toohey says, I wouldn't know. So you can see the games that Toohey plays with people, and people like Alva don't understand that, and they feel that they're doing that. Toohey is doing it for the magazine, but when he finds out that Toohey is working for another magazine, he does question Toohey's loyalty, and Toohey says, well, of course, I love the banner. I'll do anything for it. I'd give my life for the banner. And basically, he is just getting control of the banner by placing his people in key positions. All the puppets that Maritza mentioned, they are all becoming part of the banner so that he can control them and then thus control the world. So that was one thing that I really enjoyed in this section, how Ayn Rand can bring the contrasts out. Now, we talked about Dominique and Gail Wynand's journeys, and what's last time we talked about how they are similar and how they are not similar. And here you can see in this section that Dominique is beginning to see the similarities and the differences. And again, this is the last 20 pages of this section of part 3 are really crucial in the turning point for Dominique. So she, as Rob had mentioned earlier, she marries Gail Wynand in the hopes that she would suffer more and test her own will to suffer. But what she finds is she's actually not suffering as much, and she actually finds herself enjoying the isolation or liking it. And she says, okay, I need to change this now. And she starts getting Gail Wynand to do things that that she thinks will make him suffer, and notices well that he does it well. And she starts seeing right from the time that she marries him that he is very similar to Rourke in some sense. And here we are seeing Rourke coming back in the conversation through her perspective. And it was very interesting how she wore the black dress for her wedding, but then she has the flowers that are a hint of spring. And I thought that was a very nice literary element that Ayn Rand uses, because it says, oh, the flowers are faded, but you can still smell the fragrance in them. And it's for a change. To me, I just feel that's setting up for the change that's going to come for Dominique. And then the fact that Dominique wants Gail to see what he is, and she believes that he is the newspaper. Now, there is a contradiction there, that Gail Wynand is the newspaper as he perceives it, but and you can actually see that he views the world as a terrible place. And then he wants all the art and the beautiful things for himself and hide away from everybody else. In that way, Dominique and Gail Wynand are similar. So often I've come across people who say that living a life like that is expressed in Ayn Rand's story is not possible, is not practical. And I feel that Gail Wynand struggles with that element in the book, that you can see that he believes in the human potential. He believes there's excellence in humans, and he admires that. And he admires it through their work and not in the human being itself. And that's why he wants to crush those people. So in her marriage to Gail Wynand, she starts discovering the man that he is actually. And she wants to show what kind of a man he is through the work that the paper is actually promoting. And she forces him to go to see the play, which again, I just think, as Maritza mentioned, in the terms of how well Ayn Rand writes, she starts off this story, this few chapters with the conversation between Ike and all the people around. And I'm wondering, why is there this conversation? And then it comes so beautifully in the production of the play, and when Dominique and Gail Wynand go to see it, because then it's their reaction, it's how the reactions ought to be. So I'll just read that. Wynand and Dominique sat in the center of the fourth row, not looking at each other, listening to the play. The things being done on stage were merely trite and crass, but the undercurrent made them frightening. There was an air about the ponderous inanities spoken, which the actors had absorbed like an infection. It was in their smirking faces, in the slyness of their voices, in their untidy gestures. It was an air of inanities uttered as revelations and insolently demanding acceptance as such, an air not of innocent presumption, but of conscious effrontery, as if the author knew the nature of his work and boasted of his power to make it feel sublime in the minds of his audience and thus destroy the capacity for the sublime within them. And when they go home, Dominique asks him, through the play, she's thinking, she thought that this play was the creation of the banner. This is what the banner had forced into life, had fed, upheld, and made triumph. It was the banner that had begun and ended the destruction of the started temple. And now that destruction was not even an event long since past. This was not even a comparison between two unmeasurable entities, a building and a play. It was not an accident, nor a matter of persons, of Ike, Fugler, Toohey, herself, and Rourke. It was a contest without time, a struggle of two abstractions, the thing that had created the building against the things that made the play possible. Two forces, suddenly naked to her in their simple statement, two forces that had fought since the world began, and every religion had known of them, and there had always been a god and a devil. Only men had been so mistaken about the shapes of that devil. He was not single and big. He was many and smutty and small. The banner had destroyed the started temple in order to make room for this play. It could not do otherwise, and there was no middle choice, no escape, no neutrality. It was one or the other. It always had been, and the contest had many symbols, but no name and no statement. Rourke, she heard herself screaming inside. Rourke, Rourke, Rourke. And so again, here is the contrast between excellence and mediocrity. So I just think this section, through these characters, Ayn Rand really talks about integrity and the belief in one's values and to live up to those values, to be willing in any circumstance to uphold those values and do the work that we can do. So is it practical to live a life that Ayn Rand suggests in this book? Or is it like Gail Wynand says, I'm going to keep it all to myself and not share it with this world because the world is so bad? Or is it where, Dominique wants to destroy it because she feels the world is not worthy of it? And so I think Ayn Rand raises many such questions in this section. And then with Dominique's statement of saying, have I changed? It kind of starts making us think, okay, where is the turning point? What is going to happen next? And here comes Rourke, Rourke, and Rourke. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. All right, folks, so get your questions ready. The last presentation is going to be Iris. And after that, we're going to take everybody's questions first. And then let's look at the shape of the questions, and then we will do a discussion based on that. Let's see, give me just a second. Iris, go ahead. Can you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hello. Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, let's see. I always start with a few miscellaneous things. This is a really nice one. Maritza was wondering if the current book matches up with hers. It does. Page 472 is, how do you keep people from wanting to go to an Ibsen play? Okay, now, I've been listening to the audio of the book beside reading it for these weeks, and I've heard Rourke talked to the dean about 6 times recently. And, he keeps saying, I have 60 years to live. And in fact, life expectancy for a male in 1922 was 58 years. He was 22 at that point. He had roughly 36 years of life left. It's really very short. It's not, when he keeps saying 60 to me, it's not that. Let's see, mistake I made last week. Tui was given money when a man died, $100,000. That's 1.8 million currently, but in our money now. Just a little thing out of my life. I was in Chicago going to school in the 1960s, 1950s really. And a friend of mine was in an apartment created for artists. It had more than a double height ceiling, for someone doing large sculpture. And there was a small bathroom with a wooden cabinet in it. And it had a sliding door, and the door didn't have any hardware you could see. It just had a hole in the door. You put your finger in it to slide it back and forth. And I looked at it, and it had about, I think, 6 more holes than the one your finger went into. That became ornamentation. It was just a nice thing, very inexpensive. And it made me think, gee, I should find out how this building came to be. I talked around. It turned out it was Adler and Sullivan building, Louis Sullivan. And Frank Lloyd Wright had actually worked on that building. So for all I know, the holes came from him. So just nice. Okay. I also went to Bauhaus in America. It says that on the website at IIT's Institute of Design. It was really dreadful on every level. It was an art school that I went to. I was on scholarship by 1953, 54, and 55. So I was 13, 14, and 15. I was in high school. And I've always suspected that people don't know how bad the Bauhaus is. And they think that Rand made up these clever things just to make her book interesting. But real life was often worse. I know there are serious subjectivists who have written books who assume that Rand liked Bauhaus. Several years ago, I think it was the Atlas Shrugged was published in 3 volumes, and they used Bauhaus style illustration, thinking that she would have liked that. So, it's just all kinds of odd stuff out there. I didn't understand when I first read Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged that they were stylized. They were so close to weird experiences I had that I just thought of them as real life. The only thing I knew that was stylized was that after the rape, Dominique did not start counting the days till her period. So it's like, oh, okay, it's that kind of book. So I'd never come across that before. When I went to IIT, the building was tiny. I don't know how many times they enlarged the glass box. It could have had maybe 90 people in it standing in a cocktail party, but it was just this little glass box. I think I got there early because I don't think of this as something that was said to the group, but a conversation I had with someone there, that this was a perfect building. It, you know, it was so perfect that they couldn't put any furniture into it, that we couldn't have classes in it. All the classes were in the unfinished basement. And it could not have been uglier. I mean, here were high school students who were interested in art, interested in painting, sculpture, all the arts, and cared about beauty. And we were in, for 7-8 hours, whatever it was, every Saturday for 3 years I went. Unfinished ceilings, everything was unfinished, concrete. All of the lighting fixtures were exposed. I mean, they didn't even try and neaten them, hanging wires all over the place. It's just really dreadful. All the ductwork, and it was in the basement. So there was a little bit of light, a little bit of it was above ground level, but you couldn't see the grass and trees. You're just in this ugly space. We got teachers and professors from the Bauhaus school. They were not good as teachers or as people. I wouldn't have stayed, except that the other students were really great. It was a wonderful experience. And I had never had a good teacher. I went to public schools, and I never had a teacher who thought that learning was exciting and wonderful. So I would go, I'd sit in class and I'd run home and tell my mother all the wonderful, exciting things I had learned. And the two of us was kind of dance around together, but what could be better? I just want to give one example of what public school was like for me. First grade, we were taught phonics, two weeks or so to learn to sound out every word, every letter, and then we could read anything. And but we were using a textbook meant for look-see, and so for a year, the whole first grade, we read "See Spot Run," "Run the Spot Run," and I would go home and read dictionaries and all kinds of things. One of the worst experiences at IIT was something that actually was interesting and good. It just was what was done with it. Before flow was given a name, there was a lot of research done in this period. And they were trying to figure out how artists work to do their best work, what techniques they use so that they became completely involved in the work. And so from what they had learned in these studies, we were told we're going to do this one project where we would focus on our drawings. We wouldn't talk to anyone else. We wouldn't look at anyone else's work. We wouldn't keep track of time. They would take care of that for us. We would just focus as much as we could and, kind of get totally into the work we were doing. There was a special teacher who was brought in to tell us about that. The project, this was the second year that I was there, rather than a bunch of different projects each week, which we had done, this year we would have one focus, which was they would pick a play for us, and we would do the costumes for the play one week, we would do sets another, we would create musical instruments, just a whole series of things. And I thought that was great. I'd just done something similar on my own. I'd read Hamlet, and I loved the idea of illustrating the play within a play. You have the royal family, watching the royal family. How are you going to draw that or paint it? I did actually 3 paintings of it. Do you have them? one of them in full costume and the other just in very stylized, all one color. There are just a lot of ways to do it. So I was looking forward to this experience with the play. They were picking the play for us. I didn't know what it was going to be. And the play they picked was the absolute worst I can imagine. Let's see, it was down here. Oh, I'm so sorry. I really wrote everything out, but it's not in order. Anyway, it was a medieval mystery play, Everyman. I don't have the year here. And so it was, I mean, there was just nothing in it that I cared about. And you had to just get beyond that, do what you wanted to do. The Flow project was that we were going to do the set. And so just 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, pencils. You have, the whole day to do a set. And what was done in projects was after we finished, there was a railing around the room. Everybody put their work up and the teachers would comment on it. We did that. Everyone did good work. I mean, these were really great artists and really wonderful kids. And I was very pleased with what I had done. And my friend David did one of the most beautiful illustrations I've ever seen. It informs my work to this day. It's so inspirational. And the two teachers looked at it and then told us that there was just so much for them to think about that rather than do it right then, they would spend the week talking about it together. And then next week when we came in, they would give us their analysis. And there were about 40 students. We came back the next week. All of the work was still up on display. And they told us that none of it was any good. I listened very carefully. What standard are they using? Why are they saying this is no good? There was just no content. They kept talking, but you can talk for 10 minutes, but not have any information. And so they said, they really thought this flow technique, they didn't have a name for it then, was a good idea. And so what they wanted us to do was to do the same project again, design a set. It could be a different set, different part of the play. And, but try harder this time. And none of it made any sense to me. I mean, I didn't know why they thought the work was bad. And how do you try harder? You grit your teeth. There was just no information. And so I decided to just ignore everything they had said. There was no point to that. And just do another illustration using these flow ideas, which were so good. And so after our 7 hours or whatever of drawing, we were told to put our work up again. And then they did something that could have been very good, but it was useless the way they did it. They asked us one by one to tell them what we thought and felt when they told us that the work was no good, and how we were thinking about doing the second piece, what was going on in our minds when we were doing the second piece. And I happened to be about halfway through, so I listened to 20 students all say the same thing, but in different words. But they all said they felt guilty, they felt bad, they really didn't know what they'd done wrong, but nobody said that. They just all talked about how bad they felt. And nobody questioned what trying harder meant. They just, felt bad and tried to do better. And I was the middle person, and I said the kind of things I've been saying here. We had been given no standard. I had no idea why they were saying that. I thought the pieces were beautiful. I was proud of mine. David's, I thought, was fantastic. I went on at some point, talking about how beautiful David's was, and that there was no point in paying attention to them, and I just went ahead and drew. And I was really interested in hearing what was going to happen after I spoke, because I was giving people thoughts and words that they didn't have. And I thought someone in the last 20 people would say, yeah, I didn't quite think of it that way, but I was wondering why they said it was bad, or I wasn't sure what it meant to try harder. But nobody said that. The last 20 students sounded just like the first 20. They felt guilty, they felt bad, they were trying harder. At the end, the teachers did not say anything. They didn't say, what I think they should have said. I mean, right then, that was my thought. Maybe you should try and put things into words. Maybe you should try and clarify your thoughts. Maybe you shouldn't just accept everything your teachers say. But no, they just went on and told us how much they liked all of the first drawings and all the second week's drawings. Let's see if there's okay. Everything that went on in that school was like something out of Fountainhead. We had a sculpture class, and there was a kind of entertainment or something. I don't know quite why. They played either a record or tape, I don't remember now what was available then, of Waiting for Godot, which is just like No Skin Off Your Ass. It's just, a nonsense play. It actually, the class ended before the play did. And so I asked permission to stay and listen to the end, because I was curious to see, just how bad it might be. And, maybe something happened. Of course, nothing did. And I think that's pretty much it. Oh, I went there. Oh, by the way, here it is. The play Every Man is a 15th century morality play. It's just absurd. Now, I went there 3 years. I could have gone the fourth, and I decided to take that fourth year to decide what I was going to do for college. And I investigated all of the art colleges. I even went down to Urbana-Champaign to the normal school, and I couldn't find an actual college. I ended up picking a 2-year art school. But while I was investigating, one of the things I did was visit the Art Institute often. I'd been going there since I was about 2 years old, since I could walk. And I had taken classes there from my time I was 10. And the college class came through while I was there. And it was an enormous Jackson Pollock painting, drip painting. And I stood there and listened to the teacher talk for about 10 minutes about what a beautiful, important piece of art this was. And one of the students, a boy, asked what made it art. And the teacher said, if he didn't know, there was no way she could tell him. And I thought, okay, any school that hires a teacher like that, I'm not going to. And so, that was the end of that. And I ended up picking a school that it wasn't until I started putting this together that I understood what that school was. It was a school that had been founded about 1900. I don't know if it was 5 years before or 5 years after. And it still used the same projects that had been used then. I mean, some things were updated because typesetting had changed and things, but it was basically a turn of the century education. And for instance, they didn't just teach illustration, but they taught us artist's anatomy. They had a human skeleton that was next to the nude models for life drawing classes. So it was just beautiful experience. So that's one good school experience I've ever had. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Iris, that was the story of you folks doing the project and the response of the, and I mean, it's just like a torture chamber. And I thought you did a fantastic job of describing the psychology of the students, of the professors. The second time, I particularly liked you speaking out and then seeing the reactions of just wonderful, because it kind of, it shows you, it concretizes what it means to have that kind of attitude, you know, that is kind of killing of souls, you know, it's like systematic killing of souls. Wonderful. Folks, now it's time for questions. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Let's put all the questions on the table and let's see what we can do. We'll start with Joe, followed by Paul, and the panelists are also welcome to put their questions on the table. Joe, what's your question?
I have one, but there's maybe a second one that I would like to just
go ahead,
throw out there.
Sure.
I mean, so the first one is, you know, Dominique has this belief of the world that the world doesn't deserve people like Rourke because the world's too corrupt. And then you have Gail Wynand, who's saying that he needs to kill essentially people like Rourke because as a way of controlling, he would invalidate his existence and his decisions that he made in his life. So then what does Peter Keating's failing say to that? How does that necessarily impact them? Because essentially what it does is it kind of invalidates both of their hypotheses to a certain degree. At least for Dominique, at the very least. And the second question, and I just don't know how to necessarily phrase it, but what happens when you use mediocrity to undermine meaningful work? Is one of the questions that essentially Maritza was kind of alluding to with the use of how Toohey was talking about elevating mediocre work in order to undermine. And it's a very, very conniving way of actually gaining control of the society, as actually controlling the minds of a society. Anyway.
Excellent. So two questions. One is, what does Peter Keating's failure mean to the worldview of Wynand and Dominique? And second one is, what is the nature, what is actually happening when elevation of mediocrity is used as an instrument to destroy greatness? Next up is going to be Paul, followed by Rupali. Paul.
Yes. The question I put into the chat thread was something that I've wondered about. Ellsworth Toohey, when he reviews the March of the Centuries, the exhibit that Peter Keating participates in, he says it's a title for the exhibition that makes sense only if the centuries had gone by on horseback. And I never understood that line. It's the only line in the book that I still don't understand. And so I was wondering what that meant. Does anyone know what that meant, what that reference was?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. So what did the line "centuries went by on horseback" mean? Next question from Rupali. Rupali, go ahead.
So my question is to do with integrity, living with integrity and dignity, and how do you teach children or people? I mean, I would say for adults too, but how do you teach children to live with dignity and integrity?
Okay. How do you teach children to live with integrity and dignity? Excellent. All right. Let's see if anybody has answer to Paul's question. Does anybody have answer to Paul's question? Okay. Sherri. And folks, if you would like to answer any of the questions, that I'm raising, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Sherri.
Yeah, so Paul, I can give you a little architectural history here. In the book, we have what's called the March of the Centuries. It's a world exhibition. I don't think it's quite explained that way, but this is taken from the real architectural history that had many, many world exhibitions. And she's referring really to the one in Chicago, which was a century of progress. That was its real name. So she uses the March of the Centuries in her book. And I think when she refers, when she gives Toohey the line, if the centuries had gone by on horseback, I think what she means by that is the very, very slowness of the centuries going by as if you're doing them on horseback. Because of course, these are the world exhibitions are supposed to be about progress, and they're going backward to more and more historical styles. And I think that's what she puts in Toohey's voice there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Paul, do you have a follow-up question on that? Does that answer your question?
I can certainly understand the answer. My only follow-up is if the answer, what do you think, Shrikant, is the answer that Sherri's giving accurate? Do you think that's what Ayn Rand was talking about? Because I'm still feeling a little bit ambiguous about whether or not that answer was exactly what was meant. And I really appreciate, Sherri, your effort to answer my question.
Thank you.
But
Thank you, Paul.
I was hoping to get I was hoping to nail it down. It seems a little bit, it seems like it's part of the answer, but maybe speculative. It does, and thank you for the effort, Sherri, but is there something else that I might be missing?
Okay, thank you, Paul. We'll figure out if there is anything else. So the answer, I think it is about that. It is about referring to the speed, and it's a comment on the speed of progress. It certainly, that's the best thing that I can see. All right, next up, let's take one of Joe's question and maybe broaden it a little bit. The question was, how does Peter Keating's failure impact the worldview of Gail, Wynand, and Dominique? I mean, my first reaction is that they will say, well, why should I even look at Peter Keating? This is not even an issue. Like, what happens to Peter Keating? What does it matter? What really, they're only focused on Rourkes and what happens to them. So that's my kind of first quick answer to that. But anybody else wants to answer? Or let's see, did Rupali want to answer? Rupali, go ahead.
I just want to say that for Gail Wynand, it validates everything he believes in, that he can buy men's soul. And, he says to Peter Keating, you should actually slap me when I'm making this proposal. And where is your self-respect, or where is your I in that case? And so I think in terms of how does it affect Gail Wynand, it just validates everything he believes in, that he has the power to take control over men because he believes that they don't have any values of their own. So it affirms that.
Wonderful. Yeah. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
I think something here that is important to note is that what we see in Peter Keating is a severe lack of ability to decide. And worse, it's not, and that's not even it, it's the lack of desire. So he actively rejects making a choice. He wants others to make the choice for him. In so many instances in his life, we see that he just doesn't want to make the decision. He wanted the day to be over when he had to make the decision of whether he was gonna marry Dominique or marry Katie, or when he first proposed and they were supposed to get married and his mother wanted him to postpone it. He didn't want to make the decision. He wanted all the decisions made for him. So I think the spotlight that Peter Keating places when we're looking at philosophical concepts is, if you build your foundation by refusing to exercise your muscle of choice, when you find yourself in a situation where you must make a choice at the expense of your very self, well, then you don't have the strength needed to do so. And that's what we see there with Peter Keating.
Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it would kind of upend what Dominique believed about the world. You know, she would think that Peter Keatings of the world actually do succeed in the world that she envisions. Like that this is a world of second-handers, that this is the type of guy that actually is held up in esteem. And I think his failure kind of contradicts, like, you know, or counters that worldview to a certain degree. But go ahead.
Can I jump in just so his failure doesn't happen. It had at the time. So if you remember, we're just now at the point where Dominique is starting to reconsider these things that she held as truths. When she held them as truths, Peter was at his pinnacle. He was succeeding. The Peter Keatings of the world were on top. And she felt that the world deserved those types of people and not the work types of people. As we continue to progress in the story, we're going to see Peter on a decline, but Dominique's worldview is shifting. So what the story here is that also through Dominique, we're going to see it's okay. You can still have a self. You can have a very strong core and change your mind. And she's going to, and Keating's decline and ultimate failure help to form evidence for Dominique's change in thinking.
Let me add a question. We talked, in the passage highlighted by both Maritza and Rob, and I think Sherri too, is Dominique saying to Gail Wynand that both of us have committed the same treason. What is the treason? Can you put that in words?
Shrikant, I don't think we should be, I think we should let that unroll in the story.
Okay.
Don't you think that's,
Okay.
it's not that we're not giving spoilers, it's just.
All right. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. I will ask the question and then, but Iris, go ahead.
I had been asking Sherri, when did Dominique really change? Because, quite far on, it's Roy comes into the house and she's saying, well, now it's up to him. And so I really appreciate what Maritza did today, because, this is the point at which she's changing. And I had missed that. So I appreciate learning
I want to ask a follow-up question about what Iris talked about, that story of, the experience, her experience of her professors asking her to do the project. So I want to ask other panelists, what do you guys think of that? Joe has put the question on the table, what does elevating mediocrity as a means of destroying greatness? This means that these people are using is actually far more insidious, because it is kind of destroying your capacity of holding standards, of having confidence, of wanting to create. Just the number of things it is attacking at the same time, it is quite mind-boggling. So what do you guys think about that method? So anybody go ahead and type exclamation mark. We'll start with Sherri.
I didn't have time to put in, I have Iris and I shared some stories about very similar experiences. And if we ever had time, I could go into it, but long ago, I guess it was 2 times ago, we were talking about the corpses, and I think Shrikant was very happy that that we left the corpses by the side. Shrikant knows the stories too, so and he doesn't like me dwelling on them. But I can tell you though what really happens. It pulls me back to this line of when Dominique and Gail are talking, and she talks about Dominique talks about Gail as a tank and Tui as a corrosive gas. And this idea of praising the mediocrity is that corrosive gas. It indiscriminately causes great destruction everywhere, because not only for the people who are told the mediocre is good, and like Iris's class of students, they're told that they're not any good, 2, be better. What does that mean? But those who are good are constantly being shown that the mediocre is better than them. And so it's what we're seeing, of course, between Howard Roark and Peter Keating in the beginning, rather painful sections to watch. Of course, Howard Roark is a fictional character, and it has no effect of this. And people who are great have all levels of that capacity, but they're also human, not fictional characters. They're not necessarily entirely pure. And we see that with Mallory. Mallory is broken and drinking and really quite made a mess of his life because that corrosive gas has seeped into his soul. Now, his connection with Howard Roark turns that around, and that's wonderful. But even the greats like Mallory are dissolved by seeing that constant gas corroding against their soul.
And I like how Mallory describes this, because he's an artist. So even he's saying, there's this beast, this drooling beast, and you can use words and those mean nothing to it. So that's a beautiful way of capturing what this thing is. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
Ayn Rand gave a lecture in 1981 where she talks about the age of mediocrity. And the lectures are online. I think you could probably find it. And she states in there, she says, there's a quote that says, that American culture has been growing progressively grayer, duller, and more desolately empty. And that's where she argues that the nation has entered into an age of mediocrity. And, Tui says it perfectly on page 472 when he talks about how if you, instead of telling people to not go see a good play, you uphold a bad play and tell them that it's as good as the good play. But Tui says the reason for that is that people won't be able to tell the difference. And I think that that's the danger of upholding mediocrity. If you don't allow space for talent to shine, we're left with a grayer, duller, and desolately empty world. And I think that that's part of the premise and some of Ayn Rand's philosophy. It's the idea of, we are not all the same, but there's no need for us to all be the same. In fact, we are all the better for embracing those who do have that talent. And I think that that's what she's stressing to us.
Wonderful. Maritza, could you handle the moderating? I need to take a call. I'll be right back.
All right, absolutely. Okay, Joe, you're up.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it's an interesting point, because I think if you have the inability to distinguish what is good and what is bad, then you have this relativism that seeps in. And then there's this relativism that seeps in, then it's lethal. So because what happens is nothing else has meaning anymore. If everything is the same, nothing has meaning. And this is as true to say, you know, this, you could look at this and it kind of even gets to Rupali's question. It's this idea of even in ethical concerns, like where you have this relative natures of ethics, that if everything is, well, it doesn't really matter, then the world's kind of meaningless, right? So you're removing purpose from the equation. And I think that that's the fundamental thing that Tui's able to do when managing a society, when looking at society, when he's trying to desensitize people from what is real. And that's an insidious act. And that's also what people that try and control populations often do. They try to desensitize you from anything other than what they want you to see. So I think that it's a really, it's a propaganda tactic, but it's also, it has incredible depth in the sense that it's lethal relativism that it introduces, and a world without purpose, and a world without distinguishing what is between good or bad, then that's kind of dangerous.
Absolutely. You know, there's a song that says, you know, you've got to stand for something or else you'll fall for anything. That's what we're seeing here. Mike, you're up.
I got some backgrounders that might tie some of this together. IIT has a number of buildings that are named Gonzalez Hall and Crown Hall and Armor Hall and Galvin Hall. That are some of the, and how do you get a building named after you? You you give a lot of money. Now, this guy named Gonzalez is one of the halls, was a fiery preacher in the 19th century. And he organized a number of semi-important people. One of them was Philip Armour, the meatpacking person, and the other was Henry Crown, Material Service Corporation, who later founded General Dynamics, which built the atomic submarine and a few other things. Henry Crown owned the Empire State Building, which he rescued out of bankruptcy. He didn't build it, and it was built in 2 years, and it's a mess. It had low ceilings, and that's how they got 102 stories out of it. And kind of an architectural mess, not the curtain wall thing that Mies van der Rohe kind of pioneered. Well, at any rate, this place eventually became IIT, which several of you had mentioned. And among other things, besides pioneering architecture, they became a major hallmark of World War II and Cold War defense work. The magnetic tape recorder was invented, tape recording was invented there. Galvin Hall is founded by a guy named Robert Galvin and the Galvin family, which was Motorola. Motorola didn't capture the cell phone market, but they, which now I think belongs to Apple and a few other places.
Mike, how do you tie this into the concept of?
Okay, well, Henry Crown was a major thing, and he understood the problems of running large buildings in real estate, and liked the curtain wall thing. So he became a major funder and a prime mover of the curtain wall and Mies van der Rohe architecture approach, which other people that we've talked about, from Buckminster Fuller to Louis Sullivan, also had a role in. So at any rate, how do I know all these things? For a brief period of time in my misspent youth, as a graduate student, I taught applied physics and strength of materials, which is part of some background for some of this at IIT as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. So at any rate, how does that tie in? I think that ties in because Henry Crown, as a prime mover, as a real estate mogul, liked what he saw in Mies van der Rohe and in a few other technologies. And that's how Gonzalez convinced him and Philip Armour to put in a lot of money to initially start the IIT campus, not to be confused with the Indian Institute of Technology, which their logo is very similar.
Yeah, it's that's the wrong IIT, for these purposes, All right, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Maritza, for doing the moderating. Next up is Dominique.
Yeah, I have a question related to the mediocrity topic. And so I was thinking of Tui and, promoting a bad play as just as good as the good play. And I agree in the sense that does destroy society. But I always wonder, maybe this is me being a Dominique going back a little bit. It's like, it seems like to me that the world doesn't love good. Like it doesn't, like it accepts mediocrity because it makes it easy for them. Like when you see something good, it calls you higher, right? It causes you to want to take a stand. But then when it gets too hard, what a lot of people do, unfortunately, is that they'll go back to mediocrity. So if they see mediocrity, it's easy for them to hold it up as good, because I mean, I've been to bad plays and there is no correcting a bad play, but maybe people accept a bad play because it makes them feel good about their lives. So, and I guess that's where the question comes in. Like, has there really been a time in the world where we have accepted good or exceptional? Do we, I mean, and you can look at this and I'll stop. That's the question.
Okay, that's fantastic question. Okay, I'm going to take a stab at it, but everybody is welcome. This is a great question. So I think, we've talked about, in many things on psychology, we've talked about the nature of people to seek comfort and to drift. And that is what is actually supported by this kind of art. It is just trying to make you feel comfortable and saying, okay, you're okay, everything is fine, you don't need to do anything, you can just drift along, and passively going like that. And I want to make a very dramatic, not dramatic really, but really a big observation that this view that we are talking about of mediocrity actually permeates today's culture very much in everything. So if you want to see something, and Ayn Rand makes this point very, very well. She says that I am like a bridge, an artistic bridge between Belle Epoque. It was called Belle Epoque. This is at the turn of the 19th, end of the 19th century. There is this tremendous explosion because, the economy is growing, the world is changing, and everybody is excited about it, and people are trying to capture or seeing the possibility of what human beings can do. And there is an art that is produced. This is like people like Victor Hugo in literature. There is a lot of that in music, like Rachmaninoff, are from Tchaikovsky, are from that, influenced by that. There is the same thing in visual arts. You have the romanticism in visual arts. And all of that is a culture which is so different that And what she's saying is that she's the bridge, she's showing what that time was like. And like she's out here in the beacon in the middle of a fog. But that time there was light actually. There was actually a city without the fog where there used to be people who would go around in this lighted city. And he's saying that the cultures like that existed in the past. Like if you go back to, like, say, the Athens of, Sophocles and, Phidias and Aristotle and Plato at that time, it was a similar, or you can go to Florence, Florence of the Medicis and Michelangelo and Leonardo. They were not exceptions. They were great, but they were not like, there are many, many people who thought that that was the way to do art. That was the way of what human beings were. So there were periods throughout history. So that will be my answer. Anybody wants to comment? Maritza?
I'll make a comment or two. Well, most of my comments actually are going to be direct Ayn Rand quotes. So, Ayn Rand tells us that the most depraved type of human being is the man without a purpose. And another quote of hers that I really like to remember is that there are no evil thoughts except one, and that's the refusal to think. But most sudden is she has this question. She questions us and she says, why do they always teach us that it's easy and evil to do what we want and that we need discipline to restrain ourselves? It's the hardest thing in the world to do what we want. And it takes the greatest kind of courage. I mean, what we really want. And I think that is kind of at the heart of this idea that, the age of mediocrity always exists in some form or other in our society. And I think it's that, we want to aim for that which is easy. And it gets worse and worse because as we're more connected in our society by technology, we get fed this propaganda that everything should be easy. There's not as much value placed on hard work and, individual success as there used to be. And I think that, and also it's like when you live in a world where you don't have to think about the basics that used to be problematic. Like, I've mentioned this before, I don't ever have to think about plumbing. I don't have to think about heating. I live in a first world country. That stuff, as long as I pay my bills, those things are negligible. They go to the back of my mind. Life is easy. And because all of the basic needs are easy, we suffer under the delusion that everything else should also be easy. So, and if that's what the collective culture believes, it makes it really hard to make the leap that there's value in the difficult. And there's also where there's a little bit of programming within us that tells us we want to go with the group. So there's that again, that to do what you really want, if it's to the side of what everyone else wants. I think it's a really hard step. And I like the way she says it, that it takes the greatest kind of courage. And I think that ever increasingly, we do live in a world where, unfortunately, the propaganda, the marketing, it does not lend itself well to us finding that kind of courage within.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I just think anytime that it becomes hard to fail, then you see a jump in mediocrity. So where you have essentially that everything is the same, that you start to everybody gets the same grade kind of scenario, and how that kind of works. I think that's where mediocrity starts to evolve from. And when I say failure, it could be, I'm not defining failure, everybody defines it differently, but I think when you uphold institutions and forms that no longer serve their purpose, as we've talked about here many times in the past, that lends itself to stagnation. and that then it makes it very difficult and is there a society in history that has done it better than others? I mean, I'm assuming Ayn Rand felt that way about that America was that kind of society where it really was, it was more innovative, it was more forward thinking than, say, well, especially where she came from. That would be my
Wonderful.
belief.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a recommendation I have for everybody. This is a book. It actually speaks to many of the themes that we are talking about here: mediocrity, the nature of evil as being kind of small and multiple, that, you know, man of purpose, all of that. It's something that ties all of these things together in the most brilliant way. And this is a book called Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon Hill. It is an incredible book just because of its history. I mean, I was stunned when I discovered it, because this book was actually written in 1930 and it was not published by the author or its heirs up until 2010. So for 70 or 80 years, it was not published because it was considered so controversial, because it really names directly this moral issue and talks about its influence in all of society, on education, church, within the souls of people. It's his best work, Napoleon Hill. It's called Outwitting the Devil. And it's really fascinating because the story is that the author corners the devil, and the devil has to tell him the truth. And he asks him a question about how does he actually operate? And the devil tells him. And he says, oh, but wouldn't the church stop it? He says, no, I've got 90% of them. What about the parents? They said, no, parents also, I'd already have them in my back pocket. So they will hand their children over to me in this way. So it is just incredible. Go ahead, Evany.
Yeah, when you were describing that, it reminded me of a book by C.S. Lewis, The Screw Tape Letters. And I read it and I went to see the play. And it's a similar theme. It's like, it's a demon. For those of you that don't know, it's a demon that is trying to train another demon on how to take souls. And one of the things is that there's a human on earth that he's training. And one of the things he says is he tries to tempt him with like a beautiful woman. And he's like, this is what the trainer demon is thinking. Oh, I'll tempt him with a beautiful woman. No, that's not how you do it. You have him sitting in church and he's thinking about something that his mother did that made him angry. And it's just like you were saying before, Outwitting the Devil, it's C.S. Lewis too, is that he's training Screw Tape, he's training Screw Tape how to like get souls. And it's like the same theme of very subtle. It's a short book.
Okay, I'll spoil the book that I recommended by just saying that really the core question is between having a definite purpose and drifting.
Yep.
Having a definite purpose or drifting. That's all it takes, drifting. Because it seems like drifting seems small, and you do it like sequentially and you don't even notice it and you're comfortable with it. But that's where it leads. And it's like Jordan Peterson says, going downhill is easy. You don't have to do anything. Joe, and then let's wrap it up.
Really quickly,
Joe
I mean,
Sherri.
I think that this is exactly what TUI is doing.
Yes.
Right? This is exactly what TUI is doing. It's mediocrity, right? And he's tempting people into mediocrity. He's kind of making it real. And then this is where the relativism kind of comes in. So now everybody becomes a drifter. And then the souls can be collected. It's the same premise that he does. And he talks about it in the Outwitting the Devil. He actually talks about it in schools, how schools are done. And it's also done through fear as well. So how he manipulates fear, and essentially, this is exactly, if you were to write a character, it's essentially Tui that is doing this, and he's placing people in the most strategic type of places so that he can actually at some point collect as many souls as possible. So it's a really good example. I mean, you know, actually in the book Demons is doing the same thing with Peter Verkovensky.
Absolutely, and you can just replace, just like Rob did a fantastic job of showing us Tuhi as the walrus. You can look at Tuhi as the devil in Outwitting the Devil, and you can read the whole book like that. Sherri, followed by Rupali. Sherri.
Yes, I wanted to quickly raise my hand because there was Rupali's question at the beginning of our Q&A that we never got to.
Yes, we have to end on that.
We have to get to this, and it's
Okay,
a perfect way to end it.
Yes.
And her question is, how do you teach children integrity and dignity? And I'm curious to know Rupali's answer. I'm giving my own best guess, which is you have to do it by modeling good behavior. You have to do it by showing them. But Rupali, do you have an answer?
So living with dignity and integrity is one of our core values at our school. And so I have all the teachers kind of talk about it with the students, and role modeling is the best way. But even understanding what do those words mean? What do values mean? And having children come up with a sense of life idea, you know, what is important to them. And we do this, we are partnered with an art museum, and we take them every week to the art museum to look at artwork and discuss it. And we talk about what is the sense of life in this piece, or what is this piece trying, what values. And there's one huge painting of a shipwreck, and the humans are so tiny, and there is that act of, you know, courage and will. And so the students can identify those with the artwork, and they can then say, yeah, I have had a chance to be courageous, or I felt scared when something was difficult. And then we talk about how you persevere through those and how hard it is. So it is, you know, built over time, the idea of living with dignity and integrity. At least that's how I think it. You have to have multiple experiences where you have to kind of stand up to the values and be honest and courageous to do so. So I wanted to know what everybody else thought and how you've built dignity and integrity in your own lives.
Wonderful. Iris, you have something?
Yes, it's kind of related to all of this. You know, I mentioned last week that in this copy of Fountainhead, there's an afterword where Leonard Peikoff has picked a number of things that Rand wrote as she was preparing to write the Fountainhead. And in reading them, I found that it reminded me of all the conversations that I had with my parents as I was growing up, where, yes, you demonstrate these virtues, but also you put them into words. And that's what I got from reading this. I really recommend Rand's notes at the end of this book.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Iris. And thank you, Sherri and Rupali, for ending this on the right note. I got carried away with Outwitting the Devil. I'm just really fascinated with that book. This is the first time that somebody had talked about it, was planning to talk about it in one of my meetups. And I said, okay, I have to at least check what it is. And I started reading it and I couldn't stop reading it. So it's really, really interesting. Rupali.
I just wanted to read this part. I think, you know, Ayn Rand really glorified New York City, and I love it. Every time I pass New York City, I feel this way. So I'm just going to read this section where Gail Wynand says to Dominique, there they are, Dominique, the great buildings. The skyscrapers. Do you remember? They were the first link between us. We're both in love with them, you and I. Yes, Gail, I'm in love with them. I like to see a man standing at the foot of a skyscraper, he said. It makes him no bigger than an ant. Isn't that the correct bromide for the occasion? The goddamn fools. It's man who made it, the whole incredible mass of stone and steel. It doesn't dwarf him. It makes him greater than the structure. It reveals his true dimensions of the world. What we love about these buildings, Dominique, is the creative faculty, the heroic in man.
Wonderful. All right, folks. So thank you very much. Next time we are doing.
Thank you for hosting, Shrikant.
Next time we are going to do part 4, and we will be doing the first 5. So it's going to be totally to 20 chapters. We will do it in four installments. So 5 at a time. I might change the order a little bit. We might make 6-4, something like that, depending on where the natural lines are. And we will go from there. All right, folks. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.